Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by Get Around Caboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I am delighted that Tony Jordan from Parking Reform Network accepted to come onto the podcast. Very pleased to have you here today. We're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm calling from Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. And Tony, whereabouts are you calling from?
I'm in Portland, Oregon, which is in the northwest portion of the United States of America.
One question I always like to ask people is what made them interested in this whole area? Because everybody comes into this not because they thought, oh, when I grow up, I want to be in parking reform. So what was it that brought you into this?
I think there's a new generation that might grow up thinking that, thanks to books like Spot's Parking Lot, etc. I got into parking reform from a blog post on metafilter.com in 2010 that was about this book called The High Cost of Free Parking. I got the book from interlibrary loan, only in hardback at the time. If you've seen this book by Professor Donald Shoup, it's almost 800 pages. And I started reading it and I was completely captivated. Professor Shoup asked me one time, what did you think when you read the book? And I said, I felt like I was reading The Jungle, the expose of meatpacking plants while eating a hamburger. Like, I looked around my environment and I saw all these parking lots and I was kind of struck by just how invisible they were and how I never really thought about why they were there, how much they cost, how much space they took up, what their impact was on my environment until I started reading this book. And it went from there. I was completely captivated by the stupidity of American and I think Australian zoning code, parking mandates, and really shocked at how something could be so prevalent and so impactful on the cities and not be top of mind for policymakers or advocates.
It's a great book. I have that book too, and it's for the educated lay reader, I would say. It's 800 pages, so it's a bit of a tome. That said, it's very readable. The only thing I would say about the book is it's very technical. So if you're in planning, it would be great because then you read it and you go, I can see how this all fits together. So I also bought Parking in the City, and Parking in the City Chapter 1 is actually on our website. So if anybody wants to read that, I can put a link on that to the show. It gives a very nice overview about the blind spots. Because when I started this 3 years ago, I was going, what is all this about parking? Why are people so up in the air about parking? What is it? Your organization, Parking Reform Network, kept coming up on my feed. I'm like, why am I being fed Parking Reform Network every 5 minutes? And eventually I clicked on the link and then here we are. You started off with that book. And then what happened?
The first thing I did was I looked at my city zoning code here in Portland, Oregon, and looking for a fight. I had some background as a labor organizer. I was working as a software developer. I had a political science degree from UC Santa Cruz. I went and looked at the Portland zoning code, and it actually was very far ahead of most cities in 2010. In 2002, the city council had eliminated required parking for any land use near a high-frequency bus line and near our light rail stations. And so there were actually plenty of areas that you could build without parking, and that was kind of state of the art at the time. So I was kind of disappointed, honestly. I was looking for a fight and there wasn't really one to be had. I tried to get my employer at the time to implement a cash out policy, and that really didn't go anywhere. So I just was getting involved in local neighborhood advocacy and transportation advocacy. I had gotten rid of our household car. We went to a no car household with small children in 2008. So I was just getting involved in the bike scene. And then in 2012, coming out of the American recession, they started building apartments with no parking on a street near my house called Division Street, which ironically, there wasn't a lot going on. There were a lot of parking lots and industrial land uses because in the 70s, there was a plan to build a freeway on this street. And the neighbors actually fought back and they stopped this freeway in the 70s. And that was how Portland became a planning city example, because we built a light rail station instead. So you had this street that had a lot of buildings condemned and torn down in the 70s, and they started building these apartments with no parking, and the neighborhood went crazy, and the city then proposed to add parking mandates back. And so I went to city council and I said, no, don't do this. I read this book and I started meeting these people who were also there, and they weren't organized. So I started getting a mailing list together, and I wrote to Professor Shoup, and I had him write an op-ed opposing the city's plan, and we lost. Even though we had put together quite a fight, we lost. In 2013, they added parking mandates back on these corridors. As a conciliation, they added me onto some committees, as they might do, to redirect my energy. I just thought, what's missing here is we have good city policy, but there's no constituency, there's no advocacy to support these rules, to hold the line. And so I started in 2015 an organization, local organization called Portlanders for Parking Reform. Our website's still up at pdxshupistas.com, and started just covering the topic, building a mailing list, and connecting with other advocacy organizations like bicycle advocates and other transportation advocates around the topic. Shortly thereafter, the housing crisis started hitting Portland and other cities in the United States, and the YIMBY movement started to take form, and I got quickly connected with them. So over the next couple years, we fixed up what was going on in Portland, at least on the zoning side, and made some great progress on on-street management. And then I wanted to take this to help other people do it. And that's why I formed the Parking Reform Network. So when someone found out about parking, there was a place for them to go that had actionable information, that had community of practice and just support, and also trying to just keep the social aspect of this, elevate it. It's kind of funny that we talk about this as a nerdy topic, but there are very fascinating, very social and fun people who are involved in this because it's such an important topic. This is not a wonky thing that we shouldn't talk about. This really impacts our cities, and we need to talk about it all the time. And it's fun.
So a couple of things about that. I never call it a freeway. I call it an expensive way. Once I found out the true cost of expensive ways, I was like, oh man, that is such bad use of money. And I think that poor use of money, poor use of land, not appreciating just the land value, which is crazy because if you're in an apartment, you pay per square meter. If you have a shop, you pay per square meter. But for some reason, parking should be free, whatever that means. And of course, there's no such thing as a free parking spot. Someone's paying for it somewhere in some way. I think transport generally, it just crosses all political parties. We're in the outer suburbs in Caboolture, which is the northern outskirts of Brisbane, and we're in Australia. In terms of outer suburbs, if you have had any success on parking reform, what have you had? And step me through what was the process on that?
When it comes to parking reform, there's a number of policies, right? There's on-street parking management, there's revenue expenditure policies, there's commuter benefits, and then there's the big one that we're mostly talking about is the zoning reforms, the land use reforms around parking mandates. In the United States, at least, there really is a movement. There is a wave of these reforms happening. The United States is a large country like Australia. The policies are happening. I show a map and I say, they're from Alaska to Florida, from this place to that place, increasingly in between. Like Australia, we have a lot of space that's not very populated, so the map doesn't have a lot of dots in there, but it's still it's a movement that crosses, as you mentioned, political boundaries, red states and blue states, and all sorts of places. In the outer suburbs or even exurb areas, there's not as many direct successes you can point to, partly just because there's fewer places, right? There's not as many places that even need these reforms. If you look at the map, there are communities of all types doing this, and even at our statewide level, there's reforms happening. And I think part of the message is really that in these outer suburbs and other areas, for one, there's already so much parking. Even if you stop building it today and start redeveloping, it's going to take a long time before people run out of places to park. So I'll talk about choice. I say this is really just about, can we provide other options? If someone wants to live in an outer suburb without a car or with fewer cars, that's okay. I'm not 100% sure about your land use rules, but in the United States, we have single use zoning. We have single family zoning, but we also have single use zoning. This can only be residential. And I think one of the new frontiers here is to allow for more commercial use to trickle back into the outer suburbs so that you don't have kilometers of area where you can't walk to a corner store or to get a haircut or to do anything, right? These are places that are extremely car dependent. There is parking reform happening in all corners of our country, and I think that it's possible elsewhere, and the messages are as pertinent, if not even more so, when it comes to things like economic development or accessibility for people who may have other mobility issues.
Moreton Bay, which is my council, it's called a local government area, is aiming to be the most accessible LGA in Australia. And that's because we already have so many. It's not actually very difficult. You just have to create the infrastructure for that. What particular avenues of parking reform would be most helpful to create more accessibility?
The first thing we're doing is removing barriers to something being better, right? The current situation in many communities is bad. The status quo is not good for, it's not good for children, it's not good for elderly people, it's not good for people in wheelchairs. It's a situation where if you don't have a car and you don't like to drive, too bad. And so to mention the choice again, the first rule of getting out of a hole is stop digging the hole deeper. And right now we require the hole to be dug deeper every time someone starts a business, every time they build an apartment, every time they do anything. We're like, okay, we have to put the cars first. The first step is just to allow other policies to work, because many governments have action plans for reducing pollution or for reducing the amount of kilometers driven or for changing modes, making modes safer, Vision Zero, all of these ideas of housing affordability. You have a plan and you might be even implementing policy to help that plan. But if you have parking requirements in your city, you're undermining the ability. You're take a haircut off what's possible here. And I think that by removing these rules initially, the first thing is on the marginal level, those policies can work better. Parking may not be the main inhibitor to a success for an affordable housing policy, but it certainly is a problem. And so by removing that mandate, that apartment that's built is going to be as big as it makes sense to build it. And right now, I think of it like a chemical reaction, right? A person's growing an apartment building and the first thing that runs out, well, maybe is money. And the second thing that runs out is parking. And then the building stops growing, and that's how many apartments are in it. And if we can remove the parking requirement, then that building is going to grow. If there's money, if there's financing and floor area ratio or whatever the boundaries are, it's going to grow to its best capacity. Then advocates can stop wasting their time and architects can stop wasting their time building to the parking requirement, and they can attack other policy areas like, do we need better financing? Do we need to change our zoning rules? Do we need to have trading of building heights around? Like, there's other policies that you can put into play once you remove this major inhibitor. So I think that's the main policy. Get rid of those mandates if you have them.
One of the things that really shocked me about the cost of parking was actually the infrastructure cost. So I think in Australian dollars, a piece of concrete, which would be a carport in an ordinary residential home, would probably cost about $10,000. That's just the concrete. So that's not including all the other bits that go with it, like the design, and that has an extra cost. Then you've got a shopping centre. So I thought this was very interesting because we have a lot of multi-storey shopping centres here, and that costs around $80,000 in Australian dollars. And then in an apartment, it's about $150,000. So it's per car space we're talking about here. All that gets absorbed by the customers and the tenants. The owners don't pay that. They're very good at getting other people to pay for their own expenses, and that's one of those expenses they get outsourced. By not having so much parking, you're reducing the cost burden of building apartments, houses, whatever. That, I think, was the thing that made me realize that it's not just how much land is being used, which is an inhibitor because you only can build out so much parking, but it's the cost. If you were to look at the US landscape, what has the impact of that extra cost been, say, for instance, on missing middle housing?
Well, missing middle housing doesn't work with parking requirements just because it's infill. If you're requiring additional parking on most residential lots, especially when you're talking inner city or more dense areas, you just can't fit it there. And then on top of that, the cost of the paving. And to your point, just to say, the space is part of it, but most architects will tell you there's only a certain amount of parking you can fit. It gets tremendously expensive to dig down. So even if you had unlimited money, every foot you go down, you have water intrusion. There's all sorts of additional costs that come about. It really is a cost and space thing. What I think that you get for missing middle and for mid-rise apartments even is an incremental benefit. Being in Portland, where we were fighting over zero parking requirements, when someone would voluntarily build an apartment on a transit corridor with parking, I would get mad, right? I'd be like, why are they building this? And I've softened my approach because I recognize that people still drive. Builders want to rent or lease their buildings, and there are financial pressures and just cultural pressures to build that parking. But in any given apartment, in the absence of parking requirements, you're going to get additional homes built. That's what the evidence has shown. There's studies out of Buffalo, New York, which did reforms fairly early, about 2017, 2018, in cities like Seattle, which did reforms near transit lines in 2012. What they found was that people still built parking in the majority of projects, but they built more homes than would have been legal prior. And that's kind of the answer, is you're going to get a little bit more of what you want, and you're going to get a little bit less of what you don't. And over time, I think that is going to compound. It took us a long time to get into the situation where we are, and we certainly need radical solutions in some places in our cities. We do need to build a lot more housing in many communities. Relaxing these requirements, particularly in suburban and other areas, has a kind of slow burn compounding impact, I think, over time. I do think it is how we can start to reform or rebuild, redevelop, fix basically our communities that are not walkable and are too expensive and too isolated. Because year over year, you're going to start building in the ability to have a population that supports transit, that supports local business, that's interested in taking other modes. Whereas right now, we are concentrating those people onto corridors and transit-oriented development. And I think we need to start doing development that's oriented towards transit, right? Like we need to flip that around and not be just only upzoning near corridors or only allowing this near corridors.
I think the outer suburbs is such a complex space because people move here for the space, and they move because it's near nature, and then they want all the convenience of that, but then they want the shops nearby, and there isn't the density that makes it easy to calculate to get a good bus service, and it just starts to be a little bit tricky. And then you've got to build for bicycle infrastructure if you want to do it, but it's probably a little bit too far away. So I think it's quite tricky, but you do have a lot of low-income families. And so for the detractors who say, but I want to have more parking, I want to have my suburban life, I want my house, what do you say to them?
I say that that's fine. The vast majority of housing and commerce and transportation infrastructure in our countries is made for that person, right? It's made for the person who wants to drive. Eliminating parking mandates does not evaporate parking spaces. It doesn't even prevent parking from being built, and we know will continue to be built. It just does allow that option. It allows the choice and the possibility that someone, and we know there's a lot of demand for walkable communities. We know that there is demand for this lifestyle because the places that are walkable, that are traditional in their form in that way, are expensive. It's very hard to find a place to live in those places. So I think the key is, if you have a home and you have a parking space in it and you like to drive to the shopping center, it's going to take a long time for that to change. And it's only going to change because there is a demand that's not being met. The social engineering, I would argue, is the reverse. We are forcing people to drive and to live in that way, whether they want to or not, because they just don't have options not to. What I think people are afraid of really is that The Simpsons, there's like Principal Skinner, am I out of touch? No, it's them who are wrong. Like, I think that there's a bit of, people are worried that these other ways are actually more popular. I mean, what are you worried about? If you let the market decide, are you worried that your choice is so unpopular that shopping centers are going to disappear? I doubt it. People do like to live that way. I present it really as, no one's trying to take away your car. There are very few places that are going to redevelop rapidly, and they probably are places that should. They're the center of city, right? They're centers. The change outside of those places is going to be much more subtle and much more personal. If your neighbor wants to build an accessory unit, a granny flat, or not get rid of their car and do something else with their parking space, what do you have to say about it? And honestly, if they want to park their car on the street like other people do, there's other ways to deal with that too, right? The spillover parking can be dealt with parking management, which is very simple, basic, market-based economics. So it's ironic that a lot of times the people pushing back on these would style themselves as market-based conservatives, and yet honestly, this is the most socialist thing that exists in the United States, at least, is free parking and the allocation of space mandatory towards parking cars.
A lot of people have home businesses, hairdressing salons and dog grooming businesses and those sorts of things. The previous owners in our house converted the garage into a place for someone to live, and so now somebody lives there, and we actually just converted our driveway. It's full of flowers and a pretty garden now. I just filled it up with flowers.
Those home-based businesses are legal there? Like, you can have a dog grooming business in your garage, or is that legal, or is that underground?
I don't think it's legal, but I think it's what everybody does. And even if you don't have a business, I think that people often turn their garage into basically a porch.
Very few people park in their garage in the United States.
Basically, it's an extra bedroom, which is being charged at a different rate. The other thing is, I don't know why people feel that they can't park around the corner from their home, that they have to have their car parked right in front. I'm not quite sure what mysterious thing is going to happen to their car if it's around the corner and they can't keep an eye on it 24/7. I haven't quite figured that one out.
I mean, I think it makes sense. You want it nearby. It's the expectation that it's free. There's a feeling of ownership. I don't think that's unnatural. I don't think that people are bad for feeling that way. We have to think about trade-offs. What are the trade-offs between our existing policy and what would be different if we changed our policy? That's why I like to talk about what are the community goals? What are the popular ideals for what we want? We want our kids to walk to school, or we want our parents to be able to age in place, and just pointing out that those are very good goals and ideals, and it's going to be very difficult to achieve those goals and not change something. You don't have to give up your car, but you might have to make some concession. And I think there's a common misconception that people are unwilling to be reasonable. I have found in conversations around parking that people are actually very reasonable. They just don't know how much parking costs. They don't know how much space it takes up, and they don't know how stupid the rules are that have gotten us into the situation where we are today. And when you point those things out to them, it's not like they flip around and say, oh, I'm ready to become a shupista, but it definitely softens their approach. You can tie it to almost any issue they care about. You mentioned people living in the outer suburbs wanting access to nature. Some of the most exciting advancements we're seeing in North Carolina, there's a bill in there. Our country is very divided politically, and it passed unanimously. It was from the river keepers. It was water quality in North Carolina, the runoff and the protection of rivers, protecting encroachment into wild spaces. Almost whatever someone cares about, you can tie this to, like, it's messing this up for you. The trade-off is worse than the benefit you're getting from unlimited, supposedly convenient transportation by car, which we know is a lie anyway, right? It doesn't actually usually work that way. You have traffic and trouble finding parking anywhere that's worth going.
The thing about parking is that, do you want to actually visit a place which is just lots of parking? No, you don't. You want to go to the place where you've got people walking around and milling, and markets or cafes, shops, these sorts of places. We have a fantastic market, but it is next to a car park, and people are always griping about how terrible the parking is. But the market that sells, that's actually where they want to be, because it's a fantastic market. Now we're up to the part in the show where I ask you, if somebody is in the community, so say our listener is somebody with a chronic disability, insecure housing, low income, on a pension, or a mum with a couple of small kids, time pressured, also no money, fraught with all the various demands that family life have, what do you suggest either of those people can do?
The first thing I think that people can do is just be open-minded and look into the situation and learn the facts. Go on maps and look around at your city and consider how land is being used. You don't have to dive too deep into this, I think, to just really recognize, look up for yourself how much parking spaces cost. Understand that they're expensive and they take up space, and that these rules aren't solving the problems that they're meant to be. Just as a side, people attach a lot of things to parking mandates. I was at a house party one time and someone said to me, if you don't have a car, what would you do if your child got sick? And I said, well, if they were really sick, I'd call 911. I'd call an ambulance. And they said, well, the 911 response times aren't so fast. And I said, well, that's not a parking problem. That's not a thing that parking mandates fixes. Just to go back to the question, I think becoming informed and being able to have conversations, or I don't think people need to spend a bunch of their personal time advocating for this, but I do think it's important to think about what you're willing to oppose, especially for people in these two populations that are often used as reasons why you can't do these reforms. They'll say people with disabilities, we have to maintain parking mandates because they can't walk. I think it's also critical to understand that a lot of these people can't drive either. There's a great book by Anna Zievarts called When Driving's Not an Option. People say, oh, we can't do this in this part of my city because it's impossible to live there without a car. And I say, people live there without a car right now. You don't know who they are because their mobility is limited. They don't have options to go around. Those are the people we need to build communities for. So I think just being aware and being willing to engage with people who are trying to solve these problems in a reasonable way. The key, speaking up, obviously, if it's easy, I think it's the job of organizers to help those people have opportunities to be heard as well. I would actually argue that the question should be for your listeners who are not in a situation where they are mobility limited or have personal and family responsibilities. It's your job to find out ways how you can help the two people you mentioned engage better. It's our job to help them engage, not a question of what should they do. It's how our system's set up to help them be engaged and what do they need really from the community. So I know it's kind of flipping the question on its head, but I do think that's what I land on as my answer is all I can ask is that if I talk to them that we have an open conversation, open-minded, and we can try to find out what the common ground is to make our cities better. Other than that, it's up to the people with the money and with the time and the ability to do the advocacy and help those voices be heard, step aside if necessary, and make sure that their concerns are included in our campaigns and objectives.
Yeah, so that book by Anna Zivitz, When Driving's Not an Option, is in Moreton Bay Libraries, as is Paved Paradise by Henry Graber, and that goes more into parking and housing, basically, a range of other things. It's a very easy read. So now if someone's at council, at the bottom of the food chain, what is something that they can do?
One thing that I asked Professor Shoup, rest in peace, a year and a half ago when he was receiving the Seaside Prize, I asked him, what's the number one thing you would tell someone? Where should someone start? And I think this answer, it's a good one for the person you're describing. He said, take his paper, The Pseudoscience of Parking Requirements, which was in Access Magazine. It talks about how silly parking requirements are. And he said, if you have the ability as a staff person or as a local elected official to ask the question, how do our parking requirements in our community, our laws, is this paper wrong? Is that pseudoscience of parking requirements, is that incorrect? Or is our zoning code correct? Which one it is. So he said like a city council person can ask staff, please prepare a memo, read this paper and tell me. I think some of it is just speaking up. I also think telling the truth, and it can be hard, but I think constantly coming back to this, parking is expensive, parking takes up space. Parking requirements are bunk. There's nothing there. When I first got started and I was engaging with city staff and elected officials, I noticed how they talked to the community and they were so apologetic about why the city's letting people build without parking. And I think, no, you have to really believe this, own it, and just put the truth back out there because over time, I think that it's so logical. It's hard to oppose this on a rational ground. That's what I think. Tell the truth and lean on the materials we've got out there for people nowadays. And seek help, too. That's what I would say. Last thing is, don't do it alone. Find some friends. Engage with your community. You shouldn't be afraid of working with allies. I think that's another thing that staff sometimes have particularly they're afraid to work with advocates because they think they'll be seen as being biased. But they'll have coffee with opponents, with the NIMBYs. Engage and don't go alone.
So when Tony talks about the pseudoscience of parking reform, I'm just going to quote something from a recent speech I gave at council to all the councillors, and it was, so Logan City mandates 2 car spaces for a 3-bedroom townhouse, and Ipswich, which is the next door council, mandates only 1. Same house, same family, 2 different rules. That's not evidence, that's guesswork frozen into planning codes. This stuff comes from the 1960s when people were still trying to figure out what this car thing was. And we've realized what this car thing is, and we're going, oh, maybe it doesn't deliver all that it promises.
That was fantastic. And I think you're spot on with looking at regional comparison. I look at bowling alleys or funeral homes, right? And you're like, why does one town require 1 per 400 square feet for a funeral home, and then down the street it's 1 per 50? That's a very big difference in requirements, and what could it be? And it's silly. Funeral homes, like, what are we even talking about here? Like, let's just get to the business of living our lives and building nice places. Like, get rid of these things. So now your testimony is spot on.
Thank you. So we're now at the last little bit. Is there anything else you wish that I had asked that I didn't? Anything you would like to share? Any final points? Anything else you would like to let us know?
People should be confident that this is a winning issue. It's winning here. We're making progress. I think that this is an accessible message, even in places that are very car-centric. I would just encourage people who are interested in this to share information with other people and keep motivated by working with other people who care about the same issue. And so I would say join Parking Reform Network. There are quite a few Australians and there's always more welcome. That's the key, is just have a lot of fun and have an impact on whatever issue you care about by working on parking.
And the thing about the webinars that you have at Parking Reform Network is that it's usually at 4 o'clock in the morning for us. So I never have a clash other than with my sleep. And I'm not always a good sleeper. So that's why you're often seeing me. And I do see quite a lot of other Australians starting to appear on there. And I must say the quality of the webinars is fantastic. So they are worth waking up for.
We put them all on YouTube. We tried to move some around. Sometimes they're at a time that's more accessible. We are mostly in North America, so we do have that bias. It's always great to see you on those. Paola, our staff person who puts those together, does a fantastic job. All sorts of topics. So I would definitely check out our YouTube channel.
Paola is just absolutely the bee's knees for sure. All right, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and knowledge from all this past 15 years, basically. How cool's that? And you've been going for all this time. It's just great. That shows you it's now that it's starting to really pay off. It's 15 years in the making that it starts to build. Just for advocates, in case they wonder, why isn't it happening now? It takes 15 years. That's why.
Right. Well, I think someone said before, everything takes longer to get started than you think, and then it goes faster maybe once it gets going than you expected, right? It takes a while, but keep at it. It will happen.
Thanks very much, Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out getaroundcaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.